Hello, and welcome to a recording of the 2024 Rush Parkinson's Conference, which was held on September 21st this year. However, before we jump to your video, we do want to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors, without whom none of this would have been possible. So this includes our platinum level sponsors, Broad Street, Movement Revolution, Supernus, Amneal, and Medtronic, as well as our gold level sponsors, Abbott and Kyowa Kirin. We do also want to acknowledge our nonprofit partners, including the Parkinson's Foundation, Lewy Body Dementia Association, American Parkinson's Disease Association, and Davis Phinney Foundation. And without further ado, here is your presentation.
My name is David Gonzalez, Dr. Gonzalez, and I am one of the neuropsychologists who works here in the division. And even though a big chunk of my work focuses on cognition, when Dr. Gatz was talking about special problems and Dr. Kirby talking about non-motor symptoms, I also look at other facets of function, including social connectedness. So today, what we will be talking about during our time together is I'm first going to give an overview of what is social connection, why does it matter generally, why does it matter specifically in Parkinson's, and there's a lot that we are still learning about that, and then talk about what we can do to address it. So, some of you may have been hearing this, and really since the pandemic, we were all confronted with isolation during not the virus itself, but the lockdowns to help contain the virus. And as a part of that, what we were seeing was that individuals were contending with loneliness at levels and severities that had not been contended with for some time. But it wasn't just the pandemic. When we look at studies that track social connection over the years, there's actually been a trend for increasing isolation, increasing loneliness that was just only exacerbated by the pandemic. And it's such a concern that the Surgeon General last year made it a health priority for the nation. And so this is a report that has a lot of very helpful information that I'll be using to guide some of our general overview here. So when we talk about social connection, it is a broad umbrella term that includes various subcomponents and pieces. So first off, loneliness, what loneliness is a subjective experience. So it's essentially a disconnect between what you would like and what you perceive you have. So there are individuals who could have a robust social network, people around them, but if it doesn't meet their individual needs, they may still feel lonely. In contrast, isolation is sort of an objective accounting of the number of people in your life, and isolation would be a lower number of individuals in one's life. So having few social relationships, roles, and connections. Social capital is sort of the inverse of loneliness and isolation, which are more negative, and talking about some of the positives that one gets from relationships. And we can broadly break it down to two components, a kind of social support, so kind of emotional support, kind of tangible needs being met, as well as a sense of social cohesion, kind of trust, solidarity, part of a group. And these two are components of social capital. And so, like I mentioned, social connection, then at the bottom is an umbrella including all of these. So like I alluded to, isolation and loneliness are not the same thing. People can take solace in having little connection, a sense of solitude, going out into nature. There can be, we all have different needs. So an individual may have less social connection but not feel lonely. And similarly, an individual may have many social connections and still feel lonely. An example would be for someone whose brother died, and you had a routine over decades of we would get together a couple days of the week, talk about the car, get updates in sports, and this met a need. And even though an individual still has their spouse, they still have other friends, because they've lost this particular connection that served a particular function and was of a high quality, they may still feel lonely. So we can parse things down into structure, essentially the number of connections that you have, the function, there's not all relationships serve the same needs or meet the same needs. We have marriages, we have romantic relationships, we have siblings and family, we have close friends, we have religious group friends, volunteering friends, and they each serve a slightly different function for us emotionally and socially. And then each of those can have a level of quality that can fluctuate over time too. There can be higher quality, lower quality connections. So it's a dynamic and it's a continuum. You're not lonely or not lonely, isolated or not isolated. It's a spectrum of connection. So this just visualizes some of the trends that I was mentioning initially. It has been increasing in prominence outside of the pandemic, and the pandemic just made it worse. So when we look at these large surveys, like the American Community Survey that's a part of the census, they've been documenting that a little less than half of Americans, writ large across the country, report meaningful loneliness. Compared to 30 years ago in the 90s, half of Americans report 3 or fewer friends, so more isolation, less connection, whereas that was only 27% of people 30 years ago. A third of individuals are in single person households versus only 13% 30 years ago. And these graphs visualize other changes in hours in the day of isolation has been going up, as well as then hours spent in social engagement have been going down with certain fluctuation or inflection points there. And there are a number of things that can influence social connection. Certainly not just the individual and the relationships that are available to them, but also community, social infrastructure. If you have places where you can meet, if you have transit availability to be able to make it and connect with individuals, societal values too. I hear a lot from folks in the clinic, a sense of stigma. If I have symptoms that are visible, I feel uncomfortable being in public because others look at me. And so there's a broader societal value that then impacts how others act, which then impacts the individual's willingness to engage in social situations and can reduce social connection. But there are also just natural changes and as a part of our lifetimes that can happen. So this is a meta-analysis that integrated several studies over several years across countries, just showing generally that most of us have, on the left, we have just close connections and globally, folks that we interact with regularly. And then in the middle graph is looking at the number of individuals that are much closer and looking over the age of the individual, so over the lifespan from one's teens up to one's 90s. So generally there's an increase around the 20s and 30s that then naturally starts to decline over the years too. And on the very rightmost edge over here, we have a graph then of loneliness, which is sort of an inverse to where there can be high levels of loneliness, teenage angst sort of thing, very early in life, and then it kind of goes down through midlife and can increase later in life. These are natural trajectories that we see within individuals' lifetimes as well. So how does it influence health? Why are we talking about this? Connection is adaptive. It's loneliness and social connection are experiences across cultures, across time. I mean, you may be seeing like David Roy Orbison was talking about this in the 50s. Plato was talking about this in antiquity. Like it is a universal experience. And a part of that is because it serves a function. The higher the number and the richer our connections, the higher the likelihood of survival in adverse environments and difficult environments. And so whenever we have less connection that's reduced, it creates a sense of distress. There can be changes in both wanting to connect with people to where we see that individuals have more of a desire to connect with others. But on the flip side though, because being less connected can signal danger and vulnerability, there's actually increased threat monitoring that happens, and people might actually be less likely to engage with others because there might be more distrust, there might be more anxiety, there might be more worries about rejection. So there's a balance of both wanting it, but then another part of our body says, look out, you're in a dangerous situation by virtue of being less connected. And that can sometimes actually run up against our ability or our drive to connect with others. There are a whole number of health changes that can happen both in biology. Because of that threat, there's actually inflammatory markers that can impact the nervous system and have downstream effects on things like the brain, which then plays out in a whole host of concerns. I mean, this is the take home is that a high level of loneliness, social disconnection is about as detrimental to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes daily. When we look at changes in lifespans and mortality outcomes, it increases cardiovascular disease writ large, diabetes, hypertension, susceptibility to infection, cognitive dysfunction, including not just a faster rate of decline, but a higher risk of dementia. Almost a 50% increased risk in dementia in individuals who have meaningful loneliness compared to those who do not. Twice as likely to experience depression and suicide. So there are a number of negative health effects from this. This just visualizes on the right the dementia risk, and the blue is individuals who report more connection, and the yellow is the individuals who report less connection, essentially more loneliness, and you see the risk is much higher for these individuals. Similarly, higher loneliness on the left slide, we see that these individuals have more motor symptoms over time, more motor difficulties in balance and dexterity compared to those who are not lonely at study enrollment. In Parkinson's, the first study to actually look at this was only done 2 years ago. So we're only just starting to understand its impact in Parkinson's. But some research, including research that has been done here in our division, is showing that there's a much higher concern with it compared to the general population. Depending on how we assess it, anywhere from 54 to 65% of individuals were reporting meaningful loneliness relative to 37 to 43% of individuals of kind of a similar background. What we also see too, individuals earlier in life without Parkinson's, those who are lonelier earlier in life have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's later on in life. So this is what this graph is showing here. So there's a 37% increase in risk or hazard in developing Parkinson's over time. And in our group, what we were seeing is that, at least in looking at the Hoehn and Yahr stages that Dr. Kirby was talking about, going through stages 2 through 4, we actually see increasing levels of loneliness through each of those stages of Parkinson's. So what seems to contribute to it in an individual with Parkinson's? In addition to what can contribute to it in any individual, we're seeing some particular things that are most important. So what we're seeing is the impact that Parkinson's has in one's life, as opposed to the actual symptom itself, seems to be one of the biggest drivers. So what that means is that two individuals can have the same amount of tremor, rated at a moderate severity in both hands. One individual may say, this does not keep me from doing the things that I love. This does not impact my life. That individual is less likely to have any concerns with social connection versus the other person with the exact same tremor severity. If that then gets in the way of them being able to engage in shipbuilding, and they're then disengaging from going in public because of stigma in their network, then that individual will have lower levels of social connection. So it's not the motor symptom itself, but then how that symptom interfaces in each individual's unique life. Like we see in other populations as well too, the other two culprits that were in the top 3 are the number of people available to you, so the number of folks in the network, that structure of connection, and depression levels seem to be the top 3. What we were seeing when we look at different types of loneliness, there is emotional, which is having an intimate confidant, like a spouse, someone that you can share very personal things with, versus broader social loneliness, which is a sense of a close network of individuals that you can rely on, not necessarily a confidant, but still people that you can rely on that are important. What we saw is that emotional loneliness was more of a concern generally, kind of feeling a connection to a confidant. And it seemed to be more of a concern for men in what we were seeing in some of our studies here. But social loneliness seemed to be more impacted by Parkinson's disease itself. And what we looked at in motor symptoms, impact in life quality, medication, all of that seemed to come to bear on a broader network, but that also seemed to be more malleable. There was more variability and variance that could be explained by that. So this just visualizes some of the tracking with quality of life, and you can see broader or steeper slopes with connection and sense of loneliness versus a much more narrow slope or plateau with tremor severity. So what can we do? One of the biggest things that you can do to start off with is kind of, if you feel that this is a concern for you or a concern for a loved one, is actually be conscientious about it. Make what I would call a social connection plan. And we can break that into 3 pieces. One is to strengthen current relationships. That can be done a number of different ways, even just a simple message, a quick phone call, a text, an email, using voice to text, so whatever it may be, just a quick check-in can sometimes start to get the wheels turning on connection and strengthening what was there. Actually prioritize it. We need to acknowledge that our world has led to more disconnection, whether it is the advent of technology, whether it is distance in transit and the way cities are built, but there are barriers in our environment. And so just like we need to prioritize exercise, it used to naturally be built into our lives, and healthy eating was naturally a part of our lives. Now we need to be conscientious about those. We also need to be conscientious about actually maintaining social connection, prioritize it, set it as a schedule. Wednesday evenings, this is bingo, or whatever it is, we're gonna play poker. And consider actually integrating new activities with established connections. Then, in addition to strengthening current relationships, you may then want to establish new connections. And that is a part of what we've built into this conference, in particular the FAIR piece, an ability to actually engage one-on-one, talk to different sponsors, community vendors, support groups. We have an amazing slate of folks available. If you're interested, try and leverage the opportunities we're presenting here to make a new connection. You could volunteer independently as well too. Giving a little bit of yourself away seems to help strengthen relationships and connection. And then third, confront any barriers that may be present. So like I mentioned with loneliness, we may, for example, start to have more threat vigilance and concern as a part of that experience. So if you're noticing that, just check it and say, okay, there's some wariness, but think kind of logically, what are the pros and cons of then engaging with this person or trying to reach out to it. So just notice if you do have any sort of kind of wariness that's creating a barrier. If there's significant depression, then that also should be treated, whether it be medication, counseling, a combination, exercise as well. And then really be creative and adapt your approaches as needed. A form of connecting at one stage in Parkinson's may look different at another stage. Again, this is a dynamic process. There are a number of resources. These are all in your handouts, but these come from the US Surgeon General's report on things that individuals can do. It will help you with brainstorming as well individually. Also, on the Surgeon General's website, they have a very nice integration of a number of resources. Volunteer Match, the AARP has a Connect to Tools. The NIH also has separate online resources. So these are in your handout and also on the Surgeon General's website. And then if you really want to go forward with making the plan, also in your handouts is this 5 for 5 connection challenge. Within 5 days, try some of these different strategies of fostering a current connection, building a new one, addressing barriers, and you can follow along with those. The New York Times actually, they riffed off of this, and they had something that's called the Friendship Challenge that they released a few months ago, where it's also a little bit more dynamic. You enter your email, and every day they kind of give you a new challenge. So it's a little bit more interactive for those who have a subscription. It's also something to consider. And this just kind of more in your handouts to help with generating ideas for connection within expressing gratitude or strengthening connections, offering support, like I mentioned, giving some of yourself away, increases a sense of mastery, a sense of connection and contribution and meaning. which is important. So actually, even though you're getting something out of the connection by offering something, it becomes a reciprocity, which is important for relationships. And so, in conclusion, loneliness and isolation are prevalent, a greater concern in Parkinson's, and complex, multi-determined by factors in an individual, the network around them, their neighborhood, society at large. And there are things that we can do to address it. It just requires a deliberate and flexible approach, integrating tools, and just recognizing that it's important in our lives and health.